recording now, and it seems to be working. Excellent. Okay, so yeah, welcome to the Happy Melly seminar. Today with Hassan from Cisco. He's a PMO manager there, and actually he wrote 2 books, and both were bestsellers on Amazon. First one is Influencing Virtual Teams, and the second one is Don't Reply All. Welcome, Hassan.
Thank you so much, Tomas. Thank you so much for having me. Just wanted to make a quick note here. Yes, I am a PMO manager at Cisco Systems, but as a lawyer required note, I do not represent Cisco, and views are my own and not off my company. Just want to make sure that we are on record to that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, most companies do that these days. I also have to make these similar statements. So I'm not telling which company I'm from, so I don't have to do that. But so anyway, I understand that your specialty is basically virtual teams, right?
Correct, yes.
So I have just a couple of questions, and then we'll see how many people join, and if they join, they can have some other questions. So my first question would be that, okay, I'm working at a global pharmaceuticals company, and we're basically spread all around the globe, right? Which means, and we have 3 IT hubs. One is in Singapore, one is in Prague, and one is in US, somewhere in New Jersey. So we're basically all around the globe. And sometimes we need to connect people from these various locations. And for me especially, and I'm one of the agile folks or agile coaches or whatever's the fancy name for that now there, and sometimes we find it really, really hard to actually get people who have never met each other, never worked with each other, to form a team as opposed to a group of individuals. So do you maybe have any tips how to encourage that?
Yeah, that's a great opening question, Tomas. So just to make sure that I understood your question correctly, you have 3 main hubs as part of the global pharmaceutical company in Singapore, in Prague, and then in the US.
Yep.
And your question is, you want to bring people together so that you execute the right way.
Yep.
And get people performing as a team.
Yep.
And obviously in today's world, there's a very big challenge. It's you know, there is no easy answer. Let's start with that, right? First of all, you have to deal with, obviously, you know, time zone differences, and the fact that you're spread across the world. With those 3 time zones, it's even more challenging to find a time that kind of works for us to get everyone on the same page on a meeting. And then, of course, you have another layer, which is some cultural differences in terms of communication and challenges that have to do with that, right? So that's always something you want to be cognizant of and adopt. And then third, of course, it's even if you are in the same room and everyone is back from the same background and culture and everyone speaks the same language, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to have a high-performing team. You're still going to have challenges without those additional headaches of the virtual component. So there's always that as well, that how as individuals in psychology of it do you really bring them together. But I would start really with, in virtual teams, when you look at what's called a team proximity spectrum. So let's say, you know, if at a high level you draw a line, and on one end of that line is 100% co-located team. So it's a team which is very, very, you know, together in a room, right? Like, or working on site in a construction site. And then on the other end of the line, it's 100% virtual. Like your case, for example, every single member is in a different country, and they're not in the same time zone or same location. And if you look at this as a spectrum and say one end is 100% co-located and 100% virtual team on another end, and let's say the composition of your team is a dot on this line, then what you want to do as a leader and a manager is try to move that dot from being closer to 100% virtual team to as much as you can closer to 100% co-located team, right? So theoretically, just kind of move that dot, slide it from one end to another. And the way you do that is by looking at what I call the pyramid of communication. And I can share some slides with you with the Happy Melly team members after this. I'll send you a couple of emails with slides, but it's really just like a pyramid that shows the different technology that the team usually uses. And at the bottom is usually like email, and way at the top of the pyramid, there's face-to-face communication. And then in between those two, you have, you know, audio conferencing, you have video conferencing, you have telepresence, you have chat and IM and social media and all of that. And the idea is that the higher you move up, the better it is for the team's cohesive traits and level of intimacy. So you want to create an environment in that, and by the way, this, what you're doing today with me kind of being on and me not being on video is a bad thing, because you can't see my face, you can't see my, you know, facial expression or body movements and all of that, which helps you understand more and empathize with a team. And for those who are listening in, I was supposed to be on video. I'm always a big proponent of that, but unfortunately I had some technical difficulties today. I couldn't make it. But that's one thing, very minor thing, is that working with that team, turning on video, having more frequent video conversations actually helps tremendously in sort of forming some bonds with teams across the world. Because most of the time, what do? We either use email, you know, send an email, hey, you know, do this, do that, or maybe a quick phone conversation or even an IM chat, but you don't get that sort of cohesiveness that you have by turning on a simple thing such as video conferencing, right? So that's one thing. Another thing which studies show a lot of correlation between building online teams and getting more performance out of them is actually focusing on things that are not related to work. And what I mean by that is dedicating either, you know, half an hour call or maybe a few minutes at the beginning of the call to discuss things that you usually would discuss in an office, like a water cooler, right? You're on a water cooler, you kind of talk about kids, you talk about sports, you talk about your hobbies, things that connect you as a human being, right? And a big component of trust is, a big component of virtual teams is trust. So to build that, you build what's called likability, and you kind of sort of focus on having some sort of a social aspect of the calls, kind of ask and connect with other people as human beings, what are their likes, their dislikes, what their mode of interaction is. So those are just a couple of ideas. Obviously, there's a lot more, but I just want to pause here and make sure that you know, answer any questions about any of that.
Yeah, sure. That all makes sense, and thank you very much for the ideas. I would like to pause on one thing, and that's the cultural differences that you seem to mention. That's again something that we are running into, especially between our Prague or European culture and the Asian or Singaporean culture. It's really different, and we still don't know how to overcome it. So far, the best way we've been able to overcome it is that eventually somebody actually sets on a plane, goes there, spends a week there, and then they come and they understand it more. I don't know whether that's the only solution or the best one, or maybe do you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, that's a big thing as well. As we, you know, the entire world is moving towards cross-cultural communication, it becomes more of a challenge. And of course, having you know, a face-to-face meeting, if you have the budget for it, you know, being on a plane and being together in a room, at least initially when you're starting out the project, is a fantastic way of starting to build that level of trust, right? But here's what I would tell you, Thomas, on specifically on cultural issues. I would say a lot of managers and leaders, what they try to do is they try to solve the entire problem at once, meaning, oh, we have this communication issue or we have this cultural issue. What do we do about it? And what I usually advise is to try to break down this problem into smaller pieces and solve each piece at a time. So let me give you an example, right? So, you know, in Asian countries, for example, Japanese firms specifically, they avoid saying no, right? They shy away from it because no can sometimes be very rude to them, right? That you're saying no and it could sound really bad. So what they do is they kind of sound like a no, but it's more like a yes, and it confuses, for example, the American managers, right? That, hey, yeah, they agreed, but in fact, they are really not agreeing to that. So in that particular case, what usually is a good way to solve it is to be very open and honest about it, in the sense that you'd get together with your peer in Japan and say, listen, I totally understand this is a cultural thing, that if you try to avoid say no when you disagree, and I respect that. But the problem is that in this culture, they view it as you're saying yes. And here's how it could impact us. And you can give examples, right? Last time when we talked about this, we didn't pick up that it was a no, and we ended up spending, $5,000 on this, and we had to throw it away. So when you bring in someone into the conversation to try and, solve a specific problem, you can come to terms on, well, what if, if there's something that you disagree with, you can just let me know that you want to think about it a little bit more, right? So you don't say, hey, you have to say no and be against their cultural norms. You can just come to a middle ground and say, maybe going forward, if you feel uncomfortable with it, maybe you can give me a sign that you need a little bit more time to think about it, and let me know if you want to think about it. And that way I would assume that you didn't make that decision yet. You know what I mean? So this is the whole point, is to break down every cultural problem down to a smaller piece and solve each piece at once, as opposed to trying to tackle this problem as a big, ocean, and trying to come up with one major solution for it, because it'll never happen. You will always have cultural differences. And another very important thing that people miss is that it's not always just cultural. It's also based on human behavior. So, I can talk to someone in Germany and then talk to someone else in Germany, and they could be completely different characters. It's part of the same culture, but one person is extremely nice in the way they talk, and the other person might be very brash, right? And it's just the way they were brought up. So sometimes what we construe as cultural could also be a personality trait that we have to be careful of.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, thanks very much for that. Because we started doing something very similar, and that is, we started, basically the problem that we identified is that the Singaporean colleagues perceive us as rude, and then we don't let them have their say in whatever. So what we started doing is we started encouraging them in meetings whenever possible, even in these video conferences, whatever, to basically voice their opinions. Instead of just, because we assume, at the beginning, right, we assume that if they are silent, they have nothing to say, and they agree, which was not the case. They were just too shy to voice any ideas they had. So now we spent a couple of more minutes or whatever asking them, so guys, what do you think about that? Do you have any other opinions? Or can you give us some other opinions? Can you give us your perspective? Basically inviting them into the discussion more. So that seems like a good approach to do that, based on what you're saying.
Absolutely. And that's a very smart way of kind of tackling it, is that you phrase things as a question as opposed to waiting for them to give you their input or add their thoughts. So that's a great solution to that.
Okay, so excellent. Thank you very much for that. I have another question tied to that remote team and whatever. So and I've had that situation before. Another situation is that basically you have a team of people that's co-located, and you have one person who is remote, or maybe one or two, and they're clearly in a minority. And some of the ideas that you described don't apply, right? Because, for example, bringing that non-work related talk, the people who are in the office, they are still having that talk, but then the ones that are remote kind of feel neglected or something. And I know the very general advice on that is, if somebody is remote, everybody has to behave like they're remote. But if you have 3 or 4 people from a team in the office, it's very hard to do that. And so far, and I have been able to find was to actually either change the setup of the team so that they are remote, or basically forcing the remote people to come into the office when possible. So I'm just wondering, is there any other solution to that you know of?
No, you hit it on the head there, Thomas, with the fact that when you have someone who is remote, then everyone needs to kind of behave as if it's remote. And it goes back to like my earlier comment, that another thing that helps is if you are in a conference room, turning on video where the remote person can see who's in the room and the discussion's going on, as well as you seeing them and they're actively like looking at the screen and a part of it, actually helps a lot with getting that extra sense and feel that they're belonging, right? When it's audio only, it's much harder, especially for the remote person, because you need to put yourself in their position, right? When they are remote, they don't want to continuously interrupt. Oh, what do you mean by that? Oh, who's saying that? You know, I can't hear you, raise your voice. So it becomes a lot harder for them to see the dynamics in the room. You know, someone stands and starts writing on a whiteboard, for example, or someone is nodding their head. That remote person who's dialing in just using audio is going to be very hard for them to keep up, and they're not going to be as effective in reading what's going on there. So yes, I would say the first step is, if you can get everyone in a room, that's much better, of course. If you can't, then assume that everyone else is remote, and how would you deal with that? Like, if they are writing on something, they're sharing a presentation, instead of just doing it on a projector in that conference room, they should be sharing it on something like WebEx or Zoom or anything like that, so that everyone can see it, right? And then, of course, if you have the option of turning on video, that's even better, because the remote person or two can see what everyone else in the dynamics in the room to help that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another thing that we've kind of learned through trial and error, is that actually if somebody's remote, it requires much more preparation. Everything just requires much more preparation, because you have to think about, oh, there is this remote person, right? Even if I'm doing, for example, a Agile retrospective, and I have somebody remote, I have to have a tool for that. I cannot just use stickies and the wall or something.
Exactly.
And I think you also have to plan for that, because these things tend to take a little bit longer. Maybe only in the beginning, but especially in the beginning, and by beginning I mean even several months, it still takes a little bit longer than it would take if everybody is in the room.
Right, absolutely.
And that actually brings me to my other question, which would be, there is this debate on the internet, or it's probably not everywhere, but I've been reading it, that somebody is saying, the future is in remote teams, because you can bring all the talent and all the people that really share the same vision and want to build this, whatever we are building, this product. And then you have this other group of people who are saying, no, the future is co-located. You can never measure the degree of personal connection through remote teams. And the remote teams, there is the cost to this remote thingy and whatever. So what would be your take on that? What's the future? Is it one or the other, or is it somewhere in between, or is it just a pointless debate?
Yeah, great question. And that's sort of the main point that every single discussion around remote teams usually happens, right? It's, well, what does it work? Does it not work? Is it really just a hype? And then you start seeing things on the news and stories. It started out with Yahoo, Marissa Mayer a few years ago, where they had like 200 remote employees, and they said you have to be back. Mm-hmm. IBM kind of did the same thing. Best Buy, I think at the time, same thing as well, kind of bring people back in. And then you have other companies that are moving the opposite direction, from startups and all the way to big companies that say, no, we want to even hire more remote employees because it opens up the talent pool. Here's my thought on that. They can both be right. And the reason why is you can't just have this debate at a very high level. You have to take it down a couple of notches. And what I mean is, you have to also look at what is the type of work that they're doing. If they are working on things that are highly creative, that require a ton of collaboration, whether it's more on the artistic, creative side, design, things like that, then I would argue, yes, that having people be co-located is probably more or much more beneficial than having people in a remote team environment where communication flow is a lot slower and it's not as important, right? Whereas if you have something which is more transactional, you have very sort of set, like accounting, right? Someone doing your accounting books. A lot of times that is very 1 + 1 = 2. You've got Excel spreadsheets. You've got, here's the transaction. Here's the ID for it. This is what you need to do. And you see a lot of benefits of actually having people in a remote situation there than co-located. But because with co-located, they have a lot of interruptions. There's a lot of data that's not tracked in an audit trail, in a tool, or in an email. So, they'd meet in the break room and say, oh, by the way, that number should be 1700. And then it's a verbal update, and they update the system and it breaks down. So a virtual team is actually better in that case and more efficient, right? So my point is that this debate, I think, is it shouldn't be at hey, is it good or not good for humanity? It should be, here's the type of function and here's the type of role that we want to play. What is a situation that works and what is a situation that doesn't work in remote teams versus co-located? That's in my opinion, my thought. And I just think that people reacting, like for example, the mayor, you did that back a few years ago. A lot of people started attacking her that she's doing the wrong thing. And my thought on that was, well, you don't know her business. You don't know her people. You don't know what was going on at the time or what strategy she wants to work on to make that decision. It could be 100% right. It could be 100% wrong, or it could be somewhere in the middle where, yes, in some cases it's wrong and others it's right because of the following fact. So I really think you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution here.
Yeah, I like this approach very much because I also think that you cannot say it's good or bad. It always depends on the context, right? What I'm just thinking about now is, so you said that on the one end of the scale would be something highly creative, and on the other end would be something very transactional, right? And now I'm thinking about where would software development or something like that fit in on that scale? I would probably go for something more creative, but is it only me or?
Yeah, so great question as a follow-up, Tomas, and here's why. So in addition to the type of role, there's also the timing of it, right? Meaning, with software development, probably in the earlier stages, it's more creative, and as you go down the line and go through a few iterations on your product, and it's more, well, now it's executing, it's testing, it's making sure everything works, it becomes more transactional, and you can start shifting away from that. Meaning, in the earlier stages of the project, you should have a lot more interaction, more whiteboarding sessions, more co-located face-to-face meetings, putting together, discussing requirements back and forth, iterating a few, modules. And then as you kind of get used to that, you move into, well, okay, now we're sort of expanding. We know how to work. We've done this a few times. Now it's more on the transactional end of things. And we can slightly sort of have programmers, developers be more, in different countries, right? And that should sort of help work out. So that's sort of where my thought is that it starts at a lot more on the creative side, and it kind of moves a little bit more towards the transactional once you are in that space.
And it probably also helps that if you start like with the creation, co-located, whatever, you will get that gelled team. And if then the people disperse or something, you may still get that sense of the team still being there, probably, right? I have never done it. I'm
Absolutely.
Just thinking out loud now. So correct me.
Yeah, and exactly. No, you're right, because you also, so if you've heard about the stages of team development too, forming, norming, storming, performing, right? And those stages actually, when you are co-located initially, they also help accelerate that and getting the team together to get to that performing stage, right? So yes, it also helps from establishing the rules of engagement, if you will, and the different styles of working. And it becomes easier to shift that to a remote team model after that first phase.
Okay, I don't want to saturate the conversation. I've read something about this Tuckman stages of team development, and there was some research done recently, and the research suggested that the stages actually are not there as Tuckman suggested. That the research said that the two stages more overlap, and you can have a performing team and suddenly it drops into forming or something, or storming probably. So it's not like linear, right? And that's where I see the benefit of the team being co-located, because probably these dips and rises will probably be quicker than on a remote team.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I'm a big proponent. Given that I've published books in the space, I work as a virtual team manager. I really think most of the companies could move to this model, especially startups too that are starting out, even in the software development stage.
Mhm.
But I also still say that there's nothing like face-to-face interaction, right? That is still the utmost form of communication. With us being social beings, we need that sort of connection to other people, and there's nothing like it in terms of the way in which we can interact. But the next best thing we can get as close to it as possible is to move to a virtual team model where we have webcams and telepresence and technology that brings us as close as possible to that stage to gain the additional benefits. But yeah, I agree with you again. The research and studies that show it's not really a waterfall. Hey, you start with forming, then you move on, then you move on. It is a very messy sort of interaction. Some people kind of click in immediately and start performing. Others, it takes them a little bit of time, and you kind of go through the cycle. But in all cases, having face-to-face interaction is going to accelerate even the iteration on that, right? So it's not just staying forming. We're in a remote environment now. We have to get back to performing. No, it does really help initially in setting the entire stage when you meet face to face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that face to face because, and I almost think about myself that I'm a old-fashioned person because I really do prefer that face-to-face communication. However, what I've kind of observed among other people, not everybody does. Some people are completely happy being remote. Personally, I would probably die if I were just remote because I really don't want contact with other people, and that's probably why I'm doing this agile coaching, whatever business, because I really like working with people. But I guess this also depends on the personality of the people, right? And I mean, it probably can be learned that you can learn how to communicate remotely, but I would still prefer that face to face, even though I know that some other people are perfectly fine with remote. So I guess it also depends on the personality, right?
Yeah, and it also depends on what they. I mean, if you look at someone who makes, I think, over like $50-60 million in revenue. He had a company called 37 Signals, and then now it's called Basecamp.
Yep.
His name is Jason Fried, right? So Jason Fried is a big proponent of working remotely, and his thought process is that people do their best work when they're not in the office, right? That the office is a lot more interrupting, and you're there, and there's like 10,000 things that you need to do, and you're better off sitting in your room, heads down, and doing it either late at night or when you're not in the office environment. That's your best work, right? So I kind of believe part of that, right? That this is probably why some people prefer not coming into the office, because to them it reduces their productivity. It doesn't increase it. And it really depends on what we're doing with that on-site sort of interaction. Is it really a collaboration, or is it we're just sitting in a room and then everyone doing their own thing? So that's sort of part of the reasoning why some people like to work remotely and not face to face.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. That makes perfect sense. And thinking about it some more, maybe the reason why, for example, I prefer going to the office is whatever, is that when I think of it now, you're right, there are many distractions actually. So you get that sense of that you're being busy, that you're occupied doing something. Probably I wouldn't do that at home, but probably you're right in that sense that actually I would be able to do more meaningful work at home because I would not be distracted.
Yeah.
So that may be the difference.
Yeah, that's a big difference. Actually, it's a big factor. I mean, other reasons could also be, so for example, I work from home, but I do have a couple of offices that I can go to any day. We have a hoteling sort of system where I can just go to the office. The big office is like an hour and a half away, right? So I can drive there, but I'm also going to drive there for an hour and a half each way. So that's 3 hours of my day that is of lost productivity. And I can use that time to kind of make, either create a new report or deliver a presentation, right? Or prepare for it. So and plus most of the time you go there for the entire day, and really the effective time you have with your team is like maybe an hour, right? And then everyone's back to their desk and working. So sometimes it also could be a cost versus benefit. Like if I'm going there for an 8-hour meeting, it makes a lot of sense because you don't want to lose that. But if it's just going in for the sake of saying I'm in an office environment, it could also say, well, does it really make me more productive, or is it making me less productive?
Yeah, that makes that's an interesting consideration to make. Never thought of that before. Thank you for that. I probably have one final question, and my final question is that for us agile folks in the Happy Melly, like myself and some others, so there is one of the principles of the Agile Manifesto is that face-to-face communication in the development team, and that is the most effective method of conveying information. And that's actually where we are trying to get. Is it still valid, or would you say that even in a team, when the team members know themselves very well, when they have really hi-fi teleconferencing systems, they do everything that we basically described, do you think it's coming really, really close to that face-to-face communication, or that it could come really, really close?
Absolutely. I think with, again, of course, it depends on the type of technology you use, but I think with a lot of the solutions that we have today, we're getting closer and closer to the face-to-face communication. Because if you think about it, for example, we have now something called Spark boards at Cisco, where in the conference room, you can use like your finger and start drawing on the whiteboard, a really big whiteboard, digital whiteboard, your thoughts, right? You're drawing circles, you're drawing charts, whatever. And those actually appear live on everyone's laptop or tablet, right? And they can see as if they are in the room with a small video camera that's pointing at the person presenting. So now I'm seeing the facial expressions, the tone of voice, the body language, and I'm also seeing what they're presenting live, even in better high definition on my screen than it would be on if I was in the room sitting at the back of the room, right? So technology is definitely getting better and better at making it as close as possible. Combine that with, let's say, telepresence, which is really, I call it web conferencing or video conferencing on steroids. It's a lot more high definition, and you can really kind of see details with the high definition of what people are kind of giving those micro expressions in their face. So I think as we get closer and closer, and by the way, the new thing that's going to happen even more is now holograms, right? That you're going to be sort of transported in 3D, and people are going to start seeing you presenting there. Which is even going to be better if that works. I think we're a few years away from it, but it's still something that's going to be impressive in that sense. So yeah, I think we're at the stage where, keep in mind, Thomas, I mean, companies are already doing it. I mean, we're talking companies that make billions and billions of dollars in revenue are already today working in a remote team environment, and they're being very successful, and they're saving a lot of money on it too. So they're using that money to reinvest in more strategic things, right? So I think it is definitely a big part of what the future is going to hold.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that makes a very nice closing answer.
Thank you.
And some 37 minutes or something. So Hassan, thank you very much for being with us at the Happy Melly seminar. Any last words that you want to add?
No, thank you so much, Thomas, for having me, and for Sam as well. If anyone has any questions they'd like to connect, my blog is thecouchmanager.com. You can definitely check me out there. I have an About Me page, to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook or even just an email. You can definitely find me there, and I'd be very happy to connect virtually with everyone else as well. And just want to thank you once again for having me.
Thank you very much for coming, and have a great end of the day since it's morning in Boston.
Thank you. You too. You too, Thomas. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.